The ocean floor suddenly felt impossibly far away as the water darkened around the edges. Then came the impact, a crushing bite that sent shockwaves through the body. The world tilted as the predator surged forward, dragging everything in its path. Air turned to water, and every thrash only seemed to draw it closer. The realization hit hard. This was the end. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start with today's shark attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. Click the like button, and let's get into the story. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Chatham as Jake and Emma Northwood's rental car rolled into town. The quaint Cape Cod village bustled with summer activity, its streets lined with charming shops and seafood restaurants. Emma's eyes sparkled as she took in the picturesque scene, her hand intertwined with Jake's as he navigated the unfamiliar roads. "Can you believe we're finally here?" Emma said, her voice brimming with excitement. She tucked a strand of her auburn hair behind her ear, the new wedding band on her finger catching the sunlight. Jake glanced at his wife, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I know, it feels surreal. Our first adventure as Mr. and Mrs. Northwood." As they drove down Main Street, the salty tang of the ocean air wafted through the open windows. The town exuded a sense of timeless charm, with its weathered shingle-style buildings and American flags fluttering in the breeze. "Look, there's the lighthouse," Emma exclaimed, pointing towards the horizon where the iconic Chatham Light stood sentinel over the Atlantic. Jake chuckled at her enthusiasm. "We'll definitely have to check that out. But first, let's find our cottage and get settled in." Following the GPS directions, they soon turned onto a narrow road that led them away from the town center and towards the shoreline. The pavement gave way to crushed seashells, crunching beneath the tires as they approached a cluster of cozy beachfront cottages. "This must be it," Jake said, pulling into a small parking area beside a weathered blue cottage. The structure sat perched atop a small dune, offering a commanding view of the ocean beyond. As they stepped out of the car, the full force of the coastal breeze hit them, carrying with it the rhythmic sound of crashing waves. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in deeply. "Oh, Jake, it's perfect," she sighed contentedly. They grabbed their luggage from the trunk and made their way up the wooden stairs to the cottage's wraparound porch. Jake fumbled with the key for a moment before swinging open the door, revealing a charming interior bathed in natural light. "After you, Mrs. Northwood," Jake said with a playful bow, gesturing for Emma to enter first. Emma giggled as she stepped inside, her eyes widening as she took in their home for the next week. The open-concept living area was decorated in soothing shades of blue and white, with nautical accents scattered throughout. Large windows framed the breathtaking ocean view, and a set of French doors led out to a private deck. "Jake, come look at this," Emma called out, having already made her way to the deck. Jake joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist as they gazed out at the expanse of sand and sea before them. The beach stretched for miles in either direction, dotted with the occasional beachgoer or seabird. In the distance, they could see a group of seals basking on a sandbar, their barks carried faintly on the wind. "I can't wait to explore," Emma said, leaning back into Jake's embrace. "Maybe we could go for a walk on the beach before dinner?" Jake pressed a kiss to her temple. "Sounds perfect. But first, let's get unpacked and freshen up a bit." They spent the next hour settling into the cottage, unpacking their clothes and toiletries. As Emma arranged her swimsuits in a drawer, she called out to Jake, who was in the bathroom. "Hey, do you think we should have brought wetsuits? The water might be colder than we're used to." Jake poked his head out of the bathroom, toothbrush in hand. "Nah, I'm sure it'll be fine. It's August, after all. Besides, we can always rent some if we need to." Emma nodded, closing the drawer. "You're probably right. Oh, I almost forgot. We should check out that snorkeling trip I found online. They do sunset tours that are supposed to be amazing." "Sounds great," Jake replied, his voice muffled as he rinsed his mouth. "Why don't you pull up the details while I finish up here?" Emma settled onto the plush sofa, pulling out her phone to search for the snorkeling company's website. As she scrolled through the available tours, her excitement grew. "Jake, listen to this. They offer a sunset snorkeling adventure that takes you out to some offshore reefs. It says here we might even see some local marine life like seals or small sharks. Jake emerged from the bathroom, raising an eyebrow. Sharks? Are you sure about that? Emma waved off his concern. Don't worry. It says they're usually small reef sharks. Nothing dangerous. Come on, it'll be an adventure. After a moment's hesitation, Jake shrugged. All right, if you're sure. When can we book it? They have availability for tomorrow evening, Emma said, already tapping away at her phone to make the reservation. There, all set. Now how about that beach walk? They changed into more comfortable clothes and headed down to the beach, hand in hand. The sand was still warm beneath their feet as they strolled along the water's edge, occasionally pausing to examine an interesting shell or watch the seabirds diving for fish. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the clouds in vibrant shades of pink and orange, Jake's stomach let out an audible growl. Emma laughed, poking him playfully in the ribs. I guess someone's ready for dinner? Jake grinned sheepishly. Can't help it, all this sea air is making me hungry. What do you say we head into town and find a nice seafood place? They made their way back to the cottage to clean up and change for dinner. Emma slipped into a flowing sundress while Jake opted for khaki shorts and a button-down shirt. As they drove back into town, the streets were alive with tourists and locals enjoying the pleasant evening. They eventually settled on a charming restaurant called the Salty Dog, its weathered exterior and strings of twinkling lights giving it a cozy, inviting atmosphere. Inside, the walls were adorned with nautical memorabilia and faded photographs of fishermen with their impressive catches. As they perused the menu, their waiter approached with a friendly smile. Evening, folks. Welcome to the Salty Dog. Can I start you off with some drinks? I'll have a glass of the house white. Please, Emma said. Make that 2, Jake added. And could you recommend any house specialties? The waiter nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. Our lobster rolls are famous around here, and the catch of the day is a delicious local striped bass. Can't go wrong with either of those. They decided to split a lobster roll as an appetizer, with Emma opting for the striped bass and Jake choosing the clam chowder for their main courses. As they waited for their food, they clinked glasses in a toast. To us, Jake said softly, his eyes full of love as he gazed at Emma, to new adventures and a lifetime of happiness. Emma felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the wine. To us, she echoed, leaning in for a tender kiss. Their conversation flowed easily as they enjoyed their meal, discussing their plans for the week ahead and reminiscing about their recent wedding. As they savored the last bites of their dessert, a decadent slice of homemade blueberry pie, Emma brought up the snorkeling trip again. I can't wait for tomorrow's adventure, she said, her eyes shining with anticipation. Have you ever been snorkeling before? Jake shook his head. Nope, this will be a first for me. I'm a little nervous, to be honest. Emma reached across the table to squeeze his hand reassuringly. Don't worry, we'll be with a guide. And think of all the beautiful fish we'll see. As they left the restaurant and took a leisurely stroll back to their car, the streets of Chatham had taken on a quieter, more intimate atmosphere. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the town and the distant ocean. Back at the cottage, they changed into pajamas and settled onto the deck with a blanket and 2 steaming mugs of tea. The sound of the waves provided a soothing backdrop as they cuddled close, watching the moonlight dance on the water's surface. This is perfect, Emma murmured, nestling her head against Jake's chest. I couldn't have imagined a better start to our honeymoon. Jake tightened his arm around her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. It's only the beginning, love. We have a whole lifetime of moments like this ahead of us. As the night grew cooler, they reluctantly headed inside, closing the French doors behind them. They fell asleep to the distant sound of crashing waves, blissfully unaware of the heart-pounding adventure that awaited them beneath those same waters the following day. The early morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Jake stirred, his eyes fluttering open to the soft golden light filtering through the cottage's sheer curtains. He turned his head, a smile spreading across his face as he gazed at Emma, still peacefully asleep beside him. For a moment, he simply watched the gentle rise and fall of her chest, marveling at how lucky he was to wake up next to her every morning. Careful not to disturb her, Jake slipped out of bed and padded quietly to the kitchen. He started the coffee maker and stepped out onto the deck, inhaling deeply as the crisp ocean air filled his lungs. The beach was nearly empty at this hour, save for a few early morning joggers and a lone figure walking their dog along the water's edge. As Jake leaned against the railing, his mind wandered to the day ahead. The prospect of their sunset snorkeling trip sent a small shiver of excitement, and, if he was honest, a touch of apprehension, down his spine. He'd always been a strong swimmer, but the open ocean was a different beast entirely. The aroma of fresh coffee pulled him from his thoughts. He headed back inside, pouring 2 mugs just as Emma emerged from the bedroom, her hair tousled and eyes still heavy with sleep. "Morning, beautiful," Jake said, offering her a steaming cup. Emma accepted it gratefully, inhaling the rich scent before taking a sip. Thanks. How long have you been up?" "Not long," Jake replied, planting a soft kiss on her forehead. "Excited for today?" Emma's face lit up, the last vestiges of sleep vanishing from her eyes. "Absolutely, I can hardly wait. What time is our reservation again?" Jake glanced at his phone. "We need to be at the dive shop by 4:30 p.m. That gives us plenty of time to explore the town this morning." They enjoyed a leisurely breakfast on the deck, planning out their day as they watched the beach come to life. By mid-morning, they were dressed and ready to head into town, both eager to soak in the local atmosphere before their evening adventure. Chatham's Main Street was a picturesque scene of New England charm. Quaint boutiques and art galleries lined the sidewalks, their doors propped open to welcome the steady stream of tourists. Jake and Emma strolled hand in hand, pausing occasionally to admire a storefront display or chat with friendly shopkeepers. As they passed a weathered building with a hand-painted sign reading Cape Cod Dive and Sport, Emma tugged on Jake's arm. "Look, that must be where we're meeting for our snorkeling trip. Should we pop in and make sure everything's set?" Jake nodded, and they pushed open the creaky wooden door. A bell tinkled overhead as they entered, announcing their presence. The interior was cramped but cozy, with walls adorned with underwater photographs and shelves stocked with an assortment of diving and fishing gear. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 50s, his weathered face and calloused hands speaking to a lifetime spent on the water. He looked up as they approached, offering a warm smile. "Morning, folks. What can I do for you today?" Emma stepped forward, returning his smile. "Hi. We have a reservation for the sunset snorkeling trip this evening. We just wanted to confirm the details." The man, his name tag identified him as Captain Mike, nodded and flipped through a worn logbook. "Ah, yes, Mr. and Mrs. Northwood, correct?" At their nod, he continued, "You're all set. Just be here by 4:30 and we'll get you geared up." As Mike jotted down their names, Jake's eyes wandered to a framed newspaper clipping on the wall behind the counter. The headline read, "Great White Sighting off Chatham Coast." He felt a small knot form in his stomach. Mike noticed Jake's gaze and chuckled. "Don't worry, son. That was from a few years back. We haven't had any issues with the big fellas coming close to shore lately." Jake forced a smile, but Emma could sense his unease. She squeezed his hand reassuringly before turning back to Mike. "Is there anything special we need to bring for the trip?" Mike shook his head. "Nah, we provide all the gear. Just bring yourselves, some sunscreen, and maybe a light jacket for when we're heading back after sunset." He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "I should mention, though, we've had some reports of increased shark activity offshore recently. Nothing to be too concerned about, mind you, but I like to make sure all our customers are aware." Emma's eyes widened with a mix of excitement and trepidation. "What kind of sharks?" "Mostly smaller species, blue sharks, the occasional thresher. We did have one report of a bull shark sighting last week, but that's pretty unusual for these waters." Mike shrugged. "Like I said, nothing to worry about too much. We'll be keeping a close eye out, and our guide knows how to handle any situation that might come up." Jake felt the knot in his stomach tighten, but he didn't want to dampen Emma's enthusiasm. He managed a nod and a tight smile. "Thanks for letting us know. We'll see you this afternoon." As they left the shop and continued their walk down Main Street, Emma couldn't contain her excitement. "Can you believe it, Jake? We might actually see sharks up close. How incredible would that be?" Jake forced a laugh, trying to match her enthusiasm. "Yeah, incredible. As long as we see them from a safe distance, right?" Emma playfully bumped his shoulder. "Oh, come on. Don't tell me you're getting cold feet now." It'll be perfectly safe with the guides there. Jake nodded, pushing down his anxiety. You're right. I'm sure it'll be amazing. They spent the rest of the morning and early afternoon exploring the town, visiting the Chatham Lighthouse and enjoying a picnic lunch on the beach. As the appointed time for their snorkeling trip approached, they headed back to the cottage to change and gather their things. Emma emerged from the bedroom in a sleek one-piece swimsuit, a light sundress thrown over it. Ready for our big adventure? She asked, eyes sparkling with anticipation. Jake, already changed into his swim trunks and a t-shirt, nodded. Ready as I'll ever be, he replied, forcing a smile. They arrived at Cape Cod Dive and Sport right on time, joining a small group of other tourists gathered outside. Captain Mike greeted them warmly, introducing them to their guide for the evening, a young, athletic woman named Sarah. All right, folks, Sarah addressed the group, her voice carrying a note of authority despite her youth. We're going to get you fitted for your gear, and then we'll head down to the boat. Anyone here never been snorkeling before? Jake and a couple of others raised their hands. Sarah nodded, her expression reassuring. No worries. We'll go over all the basics before we get in the water. The most important thing is to relax and enjoy the experience. As they were being fitted for their wetsuits and snorkel gear, Jake overheard a conversation between Captain Mike and another staff member. Another seal carcass washed up this morning, the staff member was saying in a low voice. Looks like a shark attack. Mike frowned, glancing at the oblivious tourists. Keep that quiet for now, he murmured. No need to spook anyone. No need. Just make sure Sarah knows to keep the group close together out there. Jake felt his heart rate quicken, but before he could dwell on what he'd heard, Emma was at his side, practically bouncing with excitement. This is going to be amazing, she gushed, adjusting her mask. I can't wait to see what's under those waves. Jake forced his concerns aside, determined not to ruin this experience for Emma. He managed a genuine smile, her enthusiasm proving contagious despite his lingering apprehension. You're right, he said, taking her hand. It's going to be unforgettable. As they followed Sarah and the rest of the group down to the waiting boat, the late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sand. The ocean stretched out before them, a vast expanse of blue-green that seemed to go on forever. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries carried on the salt-tinged breeze. Jake helped Emma aboard the small vessel, steadying her as she found her footing on the gently rocking deck. As they settled into their seats, Sarah began her safety briefing, her voice nearly drowned out by the roar of the engine coming to life. The boat pulled away from the dock, cutting through the waves with a spray of white foam. Jake wrapped an arm around Emma's shoulders, drawing her close as they watched the shoreline recede into the distance. The anticipation of what lay ahead, both the wonders and potential dangers beneath the waves, hung in the air, an almost palpable presence as they journeyed towards their sunset rendezvous with the hidden world below the surface. As the golden light of the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this serene moment was merely the calm before a storm, one that would test their love, courage, and will to survive in ways they could never have imagined. The boat's engine hummed steadily as it cut through the waves, carrying Jake, Emma, and the rest of the snorkeling group further from the shore. The coastline of Chatham had faded to a thin line on the horizon, and the vast expanse of the Atlantic stretched out before them. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, its golden light dancing on the water's surface. Sarah, their guide, moved to the center of the boat, raising her voice to be heard over the engine and the wind. All right, everyone, we're approaching our first snorkeling spot. This is a beautiful reef area where we often see a variety of fish species and, if we're lucky, maybe even some seals. Emma squeezed Jake's hand, her eyes shining with excitement. Jake felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness churning in his stomach, but he managed to smile for his wife's sake. As the boat slowed to a stop, Sarah began going over the final safety instructions. Remember, stay close to your buddy and don't wander too far from the group. If you need help, wave your arms and I'll be right over. Most importantly, relax and enjoy the experience. The group began pulling on their wetsuits and adjusting their masks and snorkels. Jake helped Emma with her gear, his fingers fumbling slightly with the unfamiliar straps. You okay? Emma asked, noticing his hesitation. Jake nodded, forcing a confident smile. Yeah, just a little nervous. First time and all. Emma cupped his face in her hands, her eyes locked on his. We'll be fine. We're together, remember? Plus, Sarah knows what she's doing. Her words calmed him somewhat, and he leaned in to give her a quick kiss. You're right. Let's do this. One by one, the snorkelers began entering the water. Jake and Emma waited their turn, watching as their fellow tourists disappeared beneath the surface with excited splashes. When it was their turn, Sarah gave them an encouraging nod. Ready, you two? Remember, take it slow and steady. Emma went first, sliding gracefully into the water. Jake followed, gasping slightly as the cool Atlantic embraced him. Despite the wetsuit, the initial shock of the water temperature sent a shiver through his body. You good? Sarah asked, treading water beside them. Jake nodded, adjusting his mask. Yeah, all good. Great. Follow me and we'll join the others. Sarah led them away from the boat, towards where the rest of the group was already exploring. Jake and Emma swam side by side, their hands occasionally brushing against each other in the water. As they reached the group, Sarah signaled for them to put their faces in the water and look down. Jake took a deep breath and submerged his mask. The world beneath the surface took his breath away. The water was clearer than he had expected, revealing a vibrant underwater landscape. Colorful fish darted between swaying strands of kelp, and the rocky seafloor was dotted with starfish and sea urchins. Emma tugged on his arm, pointing excitedly at a school of striped bass swimming by. Her eyes were wide with wonder behind her mask, and Jake felt his earlier nervousness begin to fade, replaced by a sense of awe at the beauty surrounding them. The group slowly made its way along the reef, with Sarah occasionally surfacing to point out interesting features or marine life. Time seemed to lose meaning as they explored this alien world, marveling at each new discovery. As the sun dipped lower towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the water's surface, Jake noticed that he and Emma had drifted slightly away from the main group. He tapped Emma's shoulder and gestured towards the others, but she was distracted by something in the distance. Jake followed her gaze and felt his heart skip a beat. A large, dark shape was moving through the water some distance away. It was too big to be one of the fish they'd been seeing, and its movements were too smooth to be a seal. Emma must have realized what it was at the same moment because she grabbed Jake's arm, her eyes wide behind her mask. They both surfaced, pulling their snorkels from their mouths. Did you see that? Emma gasped, her voice a mix of excitement and fear. Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the water around them. Yeah, I think it was a shark. Sarah's voice came from behind them, making them both jump. The guide had swum over, having noticed their separation from the group. Looks like a blue shark. They're not typically aggressive towards humans, but we should head back to the group now. As they began swimming back, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. The fading light created long shadows in the water, and every dark shape seemed to take on a more sinister appearance. They had nearly reached the others when Emma suddenly stopped, tugging on Jake's arm. Jake, look, she whispered urgently. Following her gaze, Jake's blood ran cold. The shark they had seen earlier was back, and it was much closer this time. In the dimming light, its sleek form cut through the water with terrifying grace, circling slowly around their group. Sarah had noticed it too. Everyone, stay calm and group together, she called out, her voice steady but tinged with concern. We're going to make our way back to the boat slowly and carefully. The group began to move, huddling close together as they swam. Jake kept a firm grip on Emma's hand, his heart pounding in his chest. The shark continued to circle, its movements becoming more erratic. They were about halfway to the boat when it happened. One of the other snorkelers, an older man, began to panic. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and he started thrashing in the water. Sir, you need to calm down, Sarah said firmly, swimming towards him. Take deep breaths and... Her words were cut off by a scream. The shark, agitated by the man's frantic movements, had suddenly changed course. It streaked through the water towards the panicking snorkeler, its dorsal fin cutting the surface like a knife. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Sarah lunged forward, pushing the man out of the way just as the shark struck. There was a flurry of movement, a flash of teeth, and then the water around them turned red. Sarah, Emma screamed, her voice filled with horror. The guide's face was contorted in pain, blood streaming from a gash in her leg where the shark's teeth had grazed her. "Get to the boat," she gasped, struggling to stay afloat. "Now!" Jake's survival instinct kicked in. He grabbed Emma with one arm and began swimming hard towards the boat, using his free arm to help propel them through the water. Around them, the other snorkelers were doing the same, their earlier wonder replaced by sheer terror. The shark, having tasted blood, was now in a frenzy. It circled back, its dark form barely visible in the fading light. Jake could hear the panicked breathing of the other snorkelers, the splashing of their desperate strokes, and somewhere behind them, Sarah's pained gasps as she tried to swim with her injured leg. They were mere yards from the boat when Jake heard Emma cry out. He turned to see her eyes wide with fear, staring at something behind them. Jake looked back and felt his heart stop. The shark was charging straight for them, its mouth open wide, rows of razor-sharp teeth gleaming in the last rays of sunlight. In that moment, Jake made a split-second decision. With all his strength, he shoved Emma towards the boat. "Climb!" he yelled, before diving beneath the surface. The water muffled Emma's scream as Jake swam down and to the side, hoping to divert the shark's attention away from his wife. He could feel the displaced water as the massive predator shot past him, missing by inches. Jake's lungs were burning as he surfaced, gasping for air. He could see Emma being pulled aboard the boat by the crew, her face a mask of terror and anguish as she reached out towards him. "Jake!" she screamed. "Jake, swim!" He didn't need to be told twice. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jake swam for the boat. He could hear the splash of the shark behind him, could almost feel its presence as it closed in. Just as he thought his muscles would give out, hands grabbed him, pulling him up and out of the water. He collapsed on the deck of the boat, coughing and gasping as Emma threw her arms around him, sobbing uncontrollably. The boat's engine roared to life, and they began speeding back towards shore. Jake looked back to see Sarah being pulled aboard, her leg hastily wrapped in a makeshift tourniquet. The other snorkelers huddled together, shaken and pale. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of what had just happened hit Jake like a tidal wave. He held Emma tightly, both of them trembling, as the enormity of their brush with death sank in. The sun had fully set now, casting the ocean into darkness. Somewhere out there, the shark continued its hunt, a reminder of the raw power and danger that lurked beneath the seemingly calm surface of the sea. As the lights of Chatham grew closer, Jake knew that this was an experience that would haunt them both for a long time to come, forever changing their perception of the ocean and their place in the natural world. The boat sped towards the shore, its engine thrumming loudly in the growing darkness. Jake and Emma sat huddled together on the deck, wrapped in emergency blankets, their bodies still trembling from the shock of their encounter. The other snorkelers were similarly quiet, their earlier excitement replaced by a palpable sense of fear and disbelief. Sarah, the guide, lay on her back near the stern, her face pale and drawn with pain. The makeshift tourniquet on her leg was already soaked through with blood. One of the crew members knelt beside her, speaking in low, urgent tones into a radio. "We need immediate medical assistance at the dock," he was saying, his voice tight with tension. "Shark attack victim, severe lacerations to the right leg. Over." Jake tightened his arm around Emma, who was staring blankly at the dark water rushing past. He could feel her shivering despite the blanket. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, knowing it was a ridiculous question even as he voiced it. Emma turned to look at him, her eyes wide and haunted. I don't know," she whispered. "Jake, you almost..." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in his chest, her body racked with silent sobs. Jake held her close, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. The image of the shark charging towards them, its mouth open wide, kept flashing through his mind. "It's okay," he murmured, as much to himself as to Emma. "We're safe now. We're going to be okay." As they neared the dock, they could see flashing lights of emergency vehicles awaiting their arrival. The moment the boat was secured, paramedics rushed aboard, heading straight for Sarah. Jake and Emma watched in stunned silence as the injured guide was carefully transferred to a stretcher and whisked away in an ambulance. The other snorkelers were being helped off the boat, some of them openly weeping, others looking shell-shocked. A police officer approached them, his face a mask of professional concern. "Mr. and Mrs. Northwood?" At their nod, he continued, "I'm Officer Davis. I know you've been through a terrible ordeal, but we need to get your statements while the events are still fresh in your minds. Are you feeling up to answering a few questions?" Jake glanced at Emma, who gave a small nod. "Yeah," he said, his voice hoarse. "We can do that." Officer Davis led them to a nearby bench, away from the commotion at the dock. As they sat down, Jake noticed for the first time that his hands were shaking. He clasped them together tightly, trying to steady himself. "Can you tell me what happened out there?" Officer Davis asked, his pen poised over a notepad. Jake took a deep breath and began recounting the events of the evening. He described the initial beauty of the underwater scene, the first sighting of the shark, and the terrifying moments when it attacked Sarah and then charged towards them. As he spoke, the reality of what they had experienced began to sink in even deeper. Jake's voice faltered as he described pushing Emma towards the boat and diving away to distract the shark. Emma picked up the narrative at this point, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was going to watch him die," she said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "The shark was so close, and Jake was just in the water." Officer Davis nodded sympathetically, jotting down notes. "You both showed incredible presence of mind in a life-threatening situation," he said. "Mr. Northwood, your actions likely saved your wife's life, as well as your own." Jake shook his head, feeling a sudden surge of anger. "We shouldn't have been in that situation in the first place," he said, his voice rising. "They knew there had been increased shark activity. They should have canceled the trip." Officer Davis held up a placating hand. "I understand your frustration, sir. Rest assured there will be a full investigation into the incident. For now, though, I think you both need to get checked out by the paramedics and then get some rest." As if on cue, 2 paramedics approached with a portable first aid kit. They began checking Jake and Emma for any injuries, asking questions about how they were feeling physically and emotionally. While the paramedics worked, Jake noticed a small crowd gathering at the edge of the dock. Word of the shark attack had spread quickly, and curious onlookers were straining to catch a glimpse of the survivors. Among the crowd, Jake spotted a familiar face, Captain Mike from the dive shop. The older man's face was ashen, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a look of deep concern and guilt. As the paramedics finished their examination, declaring Jake and Emma physically unharmed but advising them to watch for signs of shock, Captain Mike approached cautiously. "Mr. and Mrs. Northwood," he said, his voice heavy with remorse. "I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am about what happened out there. If there's anything I can do..." Jake felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger at the man for allowing the trip to go ahead, but also a grudging sympathy for the obvious distress he was in. "You knew," Jake said, his voice low and intense. "You knew there had been increased shark activity. I heard you talking about it before we left. Why didn't you cancel the trip?" Captain Mike's face crumpled. We've had reports like that before, and nothing ever came of them. I never thought..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "You're right. I should have been more cautious. This is on me." Emma, who had been silent up to this point, suddenly spoke up. "What about Sarah? Is she going to be okay?" Captain Mike ran a hand over his face. "They've taken her to Cape Cod Hospital. That's all I know for now. I'm heading there myself as soon as I've spoken with the authorities." As if summoned by his words, Officer Davis reappeared. "Mr. Carver," he said, addressing Captain Mike, "we need to ask you some questions about the events leading up to this incident." Captain Mike nodded wearily. "Of course, officer." He turned back to Jake and Emma. "Again, I'm so sorry. If there's anything you need, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." As Captain Mike walked away with the officer, Jake and Emma were left alone on the bench. The commotion around them seemed to fade into the background as the full weight of their experience settled over them. Emma leaned her head on Jake's shoulder, her voice barely audible. "I want to go home, Jake. Back to the cottage. I can't be here anymore." Jake nodded, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Okay, love. Let's go home." They stood up slowly, their bodies aching from the tension and exertion of the past few hours. As they began to walk away from the dock, Jake cast one last glance back at the dark water beyond. Somewhere out there, the shark that had nearly claimed their lives was still swimming, a silent predator in the vast expanse of the ocean. Jake shuddered, turning away and pulling Emma closer. As they made their way back to their rental car, the events of the evening played on a loop in Jake's mind. The peaceful beauty of the underwater world, shattered in an instant by the presence of the shark. The terror of those moments when he thought he might lose Emma, or his own life. The guilt he felt at pushing her away, even though he knew it was the right thing to do. They drove back to the cottage in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The quaint charm of Chatham that had so captivated them earlier now seemed hollow, overshadowed by the trauma they had experienced. As they entered the cottage, Emma headed straight for the bathroom, muttering something about needing a shower. Jake heard the water start running, then a muffled sob. He wanted to go to her to comfort her, but he knew she needed this moment alone. Instead, he sank onto the couch, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion. He stared out the window at the moonlit ocean, so peaceful from this distance. How quickly that peace had been shattered, he thought. How fragile their sense of safety had been. As the sound of the shower mingled with Emma's quiet sobs, Jake felt a tear slip down his own cheek. Their idyllic honeymoon had turned into a nightmare, one that he knew would haunt them both for a long time to come. The ocean, which had seemed so inviting just hours ago, now loomed in the darkness like a malevolent presence. Jake knew that their relationship with the sea, and perhaps with each other, had been irrevocably changed by their brush with its hidden dangers. The pre-dawn light was just beginning to creep over the horizon as Jake and Emma made their way down to the beach. After a restless night filled with nightmares of churning water and flashing teeth, they had decided to watch the sunrise together, hoping the beauty of a new day might help ease the lingering terror from the previous evening. They walked hand in hand along the shoreline, the cool sand beneath their feet and the rhythmic sound of the waves providing a deceptive sense of calm. Neither had spoken much since waking, both still processing the events of the ill-fated snorkeling trip. As they reached a secluded stretch of beach, Emma suddenly stopped, turning to face the ocean. Her face was pale in the growing light, her eyes haunted as she stared out at the water. "I can't stop seeing it, Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that shark coming for us." Jake squeezed her hand, fighting back his own flood of memories. "I know, Em. I see it too." Emma turned to him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "You pushed me away," she said, a hint of accusation in her voice. "You pushed me towards the boat and stayed behind." Jake felt a pang of guilt mixed with defensiveness. "I was trying to protect you," he said softly. "I couldn't bear the thought of you getting hurt. And what about me?" Emma's voice rose slightly, emotion breaking through. "Did you think I could bear the thought of watching you die?" Before Jake could respond, a movement in the water caught his eye. About 50 yards out, a dark shape broke the surface momentarily before disappearing again. "Emma," he said quietly, his heart rate suddenly spiking. "Don't move." Emma, sensing the tension in his voice, froze. "What is it?" she whispered. "I'm not sure," Jake replied, his eyes scanning the water. "But I think we should start moving back towards the houses, slowly." They began to back away from the water's edge, their eyes fixed on the spot where Jake had seen the disturbance. For a few moments, all was still. Then, without warning, a large dorsal fin sliced through the water, heading directly towards the shore. "Run!" Jake yelled, grabbing Emma's hand and turning towards the dunes. They sprinted across the sand, their feet slipping and sliding as they struggled to gain traction. Behind them, they could hear the thrashing of water as something large beached itself in the shallows. Emma risked a glance over her shoulder and let out a scream of terror. A massive shark, far larger than the one they had encountered the previous day, was writhing in the surf, its powerful tail propelling it further onto the beach. "It's coming after us," she cried, her voice high with panic. Jake's mind raced. They were still a good distance from the nearest house, and the soft sand was slowing them down. He spotted a large piece of driftwood half buried in the sand ahead of them. "This way!" he shouted, pulling Emma towards it. As they reached the driftwood, Jake spun around to face the approaching shark. It was an enormous great white, its body easily 15 feet long. Its black eyes seemed to fix on them as it thrashed its way across the sand. Jake hefted the driftwood, holding it like a spear. "Get behind me," he told Emma. His voice shaking despite his attempt to sound calm. Emma clutched at his shirt, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Jake, please, we have to run." "We can't outrun it," Jake said, his eyes never leaving the approaching predator. "We have to stand our ground." The shark was now just yards away, its massive jaws opening and closing as it snapped at the air. Jake could see rows upon rows of serrated teeth, each as long as his finger. With a yell born of terror and desperation, Jake lunged forward, driving the pointed end of the driftwood towards the shark's gills. The makeshift spear struck home, eliciting a violent thrashing from the massive creature. "Run, Emma!" Jake shouted, struggling to maintain his grip on the driftwood as the shark twisted and turned. But Emma didn't run. Instead, she grabbed a handful of sand and rushed forward, flinging it into the shark's open mouth and eyes. The great white recoiled, momentarily disoriented. Jake seized the opportunity, wrenching the driftwood free and striking again, this time aiming for the shark's sensitive snout. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and the shark recoiled once more. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jake and Emma stood side by side, chests heaving, as they faced down the monstrous creature before them. The shark, now bleeding from its gills and clearly agitated, seemed to hesitate. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the great white began to retreat. Using its powerful tail, it pushed itself backwards, inch by agonizing inch, until it reached the water's edge. A wave washed over it, and with one final thrash, it disappeared beneath the surface. Jake and Emma stood rooted to the spot, scarcely daring to believe what had just happened. The driftwood slipped from Jake's nerveless fingers, landing with a soft thud in the sand. Is it gone?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Jake nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the churning water where the shark had vanished. "I think so," he said. "For now, at least." As the adrenaline began to wear off, Jake felt his knees go weak. He sank to the sand, pulling Emma down with him. They clung to each other, both shaking uncontrollably as the full impact of what they'd just experienced washed over them. "You saved us," Emma said, her voice muffled against Jake's chest. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Jake shook his head, pulling back to look at her. "We saved us," he corrected. "I couldn't have done it without you." That sand in its eyes. That was quick thinking. Emma managed a weak smile, but it quickly faded. "Jake," she said, her voice serious, "what was a great white shark doing so close to shore? And why did it come after us on the beach? That's not normal behavior, is it?" Jake frowned, considering her questions. "No, it's not," he agreed. "Something's not right here. We need to report this to the authorities." As if on cue, they heard shouts coming from further down the beach. Looking up, they saw a group of early morning joggers rushing towards them, cell phones in hand. "Are you okay?" one of the joggers called out as they approached. "We saw what happened. It was incredible. I've already called 911. Jake nodded, slowly getting to his feet and helping Emma up. "We're okay," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure if that was true. "But we need to speak to the police, and probably some marine biologists. Something strange is going on with the sharks in this area." As sirens began to wail in the distance, Jake wrapped his arm around Emma's shoulders, holding her close. They stared out at the seemingly peaceful ocean, now tinged orange and pink by the rising sun. "I thought our adventure was over yesterday," Emma said quietly, "but I have a feeling it's only just beginning." Jake nodded grimly. The terror of the shark attack was still fresh, but now it was mingled with a growing sense of curiosity and determination. Whatever was causing these unusual shark behaviors, they were now a part of it. And somehow, Jake knew, they would have to see it through to the end. As the first police car pulled up on the beach access road, Jake squeezed Emma's hand. "Whatever happens next," he said, "we face it together. No more pushing each other away. Deal?" Emma looked up at him, a mix of love and resolve in her eyes. "Deal," she agreed. They turned to meet the approaching officers, ready to recount their harrowing experience. But even as they began to explain what had happened, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous adventure than they could have ever imagined. The Chatham police station buzzed with activity as Jake and Emma sat in hard plastic chairs, wrapped in shock blankets. Officers rushed back and forth, phones rang incessantly, and hushed conversations filled the air. The couple had spent the last 2 hours recounting their harrowing experience to a series of increasingly concerned officials. Detective Sarah Larson, a stern-faced woman in her late 40s, approached them with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Here," she said, her voice gentler than her appearance suggested. "You two look like you could use this." Jake accepted the cup gratefully, his hand still shaking slightly. "Thanks," he murmured. "Any news on what's going on out there?" Detective Larson sighed, pulling up a chair to sit across from them. "We've got marine biologists and wildlife officials combing the beach and nearby waters. So far, no sign of the great white you encountered, but they did find some blood and tissue samples where you said you struck it." Emma leaned forward, her eyes wide. "And? What did they say?" "Well," Larson began, her brow furrowing, "preliminary results show some anomalies. They're rushing more comprehensive tests, but something about the shark's DNA isn't quite right." Jake and Emma exchanged worried glances. "What does that mean?" Jake asked. "Jake." Before Larson could answer, a commotion near the station's entrance drew their attention. A man in a rumpled suit burst through the doors, his face red with exertion and what looked like barely contained panic. "Where's the chief?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the room. "We've got another situation." Chief Rodriguez emerged from his office, his face grave. "In here, Mayor Holbrook," he said, gesturing for the agitated man to join him. As the door closed behind them, the station erupted into a flurry of whispered speculations. Detective Larson stood, her expression tightening. "Excuse me," she said to Jake and Emma. "I need to see what's going on." Left alone, Jake turned to Emma, noticing the dark circles under her eyes and the pallor of her skin. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly. Emma attempted a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm okay. Just, processing, I guess. You?" Jake nodded, reaching out to take her hand. "Same. I keep replaying it all in my head. The beach, the shark, you throwing that sand." He trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. "We make a pretty good team," Emma said, squeezing his hand. Their moment was interrupted as the chief's door flew open. Mayor Holbrook stormed out, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "This is unacceptable," he shouted. "We need to close the beaches immediately." Chief Rodriguez followed, his voice low but firm. "Sir, we can't cause a panic. We need more information before we take such drastic—" "More information?" Holbrook spun around, jabbing a finger at the chief's chest. "We've got 2 shark attacks in as many days. And now this? How much more information do you need?" The station fell silent, all eyes on the confrontation. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Now this?" he whispered to Emma. "What do you think happened?" Before Emma could respond, Detective Larson approached them again, her face grim. "Mr. and Mrs. Northwood," she said quietly. "I'm afraid we need your help again." Jake stood, pulling Emma up with him. "What's going on?" Larson glanced around, then leaned in closer. "There's been another incident. A fishing boat was attacked about a mile offshore. The Coast Guard is bringing in survivors now." "But—" she hesitated, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "It's bad, really bad." Emma gasped, her hand tightening in Jake's. "What can we do?" "We need you to come with us to the harbor," Larson explained. "You're the only ones who've encountered these sharks and lived to tell about it. Your insights could be crucial." Jake looked at Emma, seeing the fear in her eyes but also a steely resolve. He nodded. "We'll come." The drive to the harbor was tense, the silence in the police cruiser broken only by the crackle of the radio and the wail of distant sirens. As they approached, Jake could see a crowd gathering at the water's edge, held back by a line of officers. Larson parked and led them through the throng, flashing her badge to clear a path. As they reached the dock, Jake felt his heart drop. The fishing boat, or what was left of it, was being towed in. Its hull was torn to shreds, great chunks missing as if bitten away by enormous jaws. A Coast Guard vessel pulled alongside, and Jake watched in horror as paramedics began unloading victims. Men with torn clothing and blood-soaked bandages were carefully transferred to waiting ambulances. The air was filled with groans of pain and shouts of medical jargon. "Oh my God," Emma whispered, her face pale. "Jake, look." Following her gaze, Jake saw a body bag being solemnly carried off the Coast Guard boat. Then another. And another. Detective Larson approached a Coast Guard officer, speaking in hushed tones. After a moment, she returned to Jake and Emma. "3 survivors," she said grimly. 5 confirmed dead, 2 still missing. Jake felt a wave of nausea wash over him. What happened out there? Before Larson could answer, a commotion erupted near one of the ambulances. A man, his arm heavily bandaged and his face streaked with blood and terror, was fighting off the paramedics. "You don't understand," he was shouting, his voice hoarse and desperate. "It wasn't just sharks. There was something else out there." Jake and Emma exchanged glances, then moved closer, drawn by a morbid curiosity. The man's wild eyes locked onto them. "You!" he cried, pointing at Jake. "You're the one from the beach this morning. You saw it too, didn't you? Tell them." Jake approached cautiously, aware of Larson close behind him. "Saw what?" he asked gently. The man's face crumpled, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. It was huge. Bigger than any shark I've ever seen. But it wasn't just a shark. It was wrong. Its eyes. He shuddered violently. Its eyes were glowing. A paramedic took advantage of the man's distraction to administer a sedative. As he slumped back onto the gurney, Jake turned to Larson, his mind reeling. "Detective," he said slowly, "I think we need to talk to those marine biologists again. Something very strange is happening here." Larson nodded, her face grim. "I agree. But first I need you both to come with me. There's someone you need to meet." She led them away from the chaos of the dock, towards a nondescript van parked at the edge of the lot. As they approached, the back doors swung open, revealing an interior crammed with high-tech equipment. A man in a rumpled suit stepped out, his salt and pepper hair wild, and his eyes sharp behind thick-rimmed glasses. "Mr. and Mrs. Northwood," Larson said. "This is Dr. Alan Brody from the Oceanographic Institute. He has a unique perspective on what's happening here. Doctor." Brody extended his hand, his grip firm as he shook first Jake's hand, then Emma's. "I understand you've had quite the experience," he said, his voice carrying a hint of excitement despite the grim circumstances. "I'm very interested in hearing your account firsthand." Jake frowned, a spark of anger flaring in his chest. "People are dying, Dr. Brody. This isn't some scientific curiosity." Brody's expression sobered. "Of course, you're right. I apologize if I seemed insensitive. It's just, well, I've been tracking anomalies like this for years, and this is the first time I've had concrete evidence." Emma leaned forward. Her curiosity piqued despite her lingering fear. "Anomalies? What do you mean?" Brody glanced around, then gestured for them to join him in the van. Once inside, he closed the doors and turned to a bank of computer screens. "For the past decade, I've been monitoring unusual marine activity along the eastern seaboard. Increased shark attacks, yes, but also sightings of unidentified marine life." He pulled up a series of grainy photos and videos. Jake and Emma leaned in, their eyes widening as they saw glimpses of massive shapes in the water, glowing eyes in the depths, and in one particularly chilling image, an enormous fin that looked nothing like any shark they'd ever seen. "What we're dealing with," Brody continued, his voice low and intense, "is something beyond our current scientific understanding. I believe these sharks, including the one you encountered this morning, are changed somehow. Mutated." Jake shook his head, struggling to process what he was hearing. "Mutated? How? Why?" Brody sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "That's what we need to find out, and quickly, before more lives are lost." Emma, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. "The water samples," she said, "from where we struck the shark this morning. You said there were anomalies in the DNA?" Larson nodded. "That's right. Dr. Brody, can you explain?" Brody turned back to his computers. pulling up a complex display of genetic data. The samples show signs of genetic manipulation. It's subtle but unmistakable to those who know what to look for. These sharks have been altered. Their aggression enhanced, their size increased, and their natural limitations removed. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying someone did this on purpose? Created some kind of super shark? Brody's eyes met Jake's, his expression grim. That's exactly what I'm saying. And now, they've lost control of their creation. A heavy silence fell over the van. Jake looked at Emma, seeing his own mix of fear and determination reflected in her eyes. They had come to Chatham for a peaceful honeymoon, but now found themselves at the center of something far bigger and more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. So, Jake said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his gut, what do we do now? Brody smiled, a glint of excitement returning to his eyes. Now, Mr. Northwood, we hunt, but not just for the sharks. We need to find who's behind this, and we need to stop them before it's too late. As if to punctuate his words, a distant scream echoed from the direction of the beach, followed by the wail of sirens. Jake and Emma exchanged a look of grim determination. Their honeymoon had turned into a nightmare, but they were in this together now, for better or for worse. Whatever horrors lurked beneath the waves, whatever sinister forces were at work, they would face it head-on. The peaceful beaches of Chatham had become a battleground, and Jake and Emma found themselves on the front lines of a war they never knew existed. The sun had barely risen over Chatham when Jake and Emma found themselves aboard Dr. Brody's research vessel, the Nautilus. The sleek boat cut through the choppy waters of the Atlantic, its deck bustling with activity as Brody's team of scientists prepared their equipment. Jake stood at the rail, his eyes scanning the horizon. The events of the past few days had left him feeling both exhausted and wired, his nerves on constant high alert. Emma joined him, slipping her hand into his. How are you holding up? She asked softly. Jake squeezed her hand, appreciating her steady presence. I'm okay, just processing everything, I guess. You? Emma nodded, her gaze fixed on the water. Same. It all feels so surreal. 2 days ago, we were just on our honeymoon. Now we're hunting mutant sharks. A wry smile tugged at Jake's lips. Not exactly the adventure we had in mind, huh? Their moment was interrupted by Dr. Brody's approach. The scientist's eyes were bright with a mix of excitement and concern. We're approaching the coordinates of yesterday's attack, he announced. I need you both to be ready. If we encounter any of these creatures, your first-hand experience could be crucial. Jake nodded grimly. We understand, Doctor. What exactly are we looking for? Brody gestured to the array of equipment lining the deck. We've got sonar, underwater cameras, and a specially designed net to collect DNA samples. But honestly, we're in uncharted territory here. These sharks aren't behaving like any known species. We need to be prepared for anything. As if on cue, one of Brody's assistants called out from the ship's bridge. Dr. Brody, we've got something on the sonar. They rushed to the monitoring station, crowding around a screen displaying a mass of shifting shapes beneath the boat. Brody's brow furrowed as he studied the image. This can't be right, he muttered. The size of these signatures? They're massive. Emma leaned in, her face pale. How massive are we talking? Brody's reply was cut off by a sudden, violent jolt that rocked the entire boat. Alarms blared as the crew scrambled to maintain balance. What was that? Jake shouted over the din. Brody's eyes were wide with a mix of fear and awe. I think we just found what we were looking for. The boat lurched again, and this time Jake caught a glimpse of something breaking the surface about 50 yards out. A dorsal fin, easily 6 feet tall, sliced through the water before disappearing beneath the waves. My God, Brody breathed. It's even bigger than I anticipated. Emma clutched Jake's arm, her nails digging into his skin. Jake, look. Following her gaze, Jake felt his blood run cold. Surrounding the boat, at least a dozen fins were now visible, circling like sharks around wounded prey. But these were no ordinary sharks. Their fins were misshapen, some bearing strange bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in the water. Brody was shouting orders to his team, directing them to deploy cameras and collection equipment. But Jake could see the fear in the crew's eyes. They were scientists, not shark hunters, and they were woefully unprepared for the nightmare surrounding them. Suddenly, one of the mutant sharks breached fully, its massive body arcing through the air mere feet from the boat. Jake caught a glimpse of its face, a nightmarish visage of distorted features, glowing eyes, and rows upon rows of serrated teeth. As the creature crashed back into the water, it sent a wave washing over the deck, knocking several crew members off their feet. Equipment slid across the wet surface, some of it toppling into the churning sea. "We need to get out of here," Jake yelled to Brody. "This is too dangerous." Brody shook his head, his eyes never leaving the surrounding water. "We can't. This is our only chance to gather the data we need. If we leave now, we'll have nothing to combat this threat." Emma's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with determination. "Then we need a plan. We can't just sit here and wait to be eaten." As if in response to her words, one of the sharks rammed the boat's hull, the impact sending shudders through the entire vessel. Alarms blared even louder as the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Dr. Brody, we're taking on water. We need to head back to shore immediately." Brody's face contorted with frustration and fear. "No, we can't leave yet. We need more time." Jake grabbed the scientist's shoulder, forcing him to meet his gaze. "Doctor, listen to me. If we stay, we all die. Whatever data you've collected, it'll have to be enough. We need to go. Now." For a moment, Brody looked like he might argue further. But another violent impact against the hull seemed to shake him out of his scientific fervor. He nodded grimly. "You're right. Captain, get us out of here." The boat's engines roared to life and they began to move. But the sharks, sensing their prey's attempt to escape, redoubled their efforts. The water around them churned with activity as massive bodies slammed against the hull repeatedly. Jake held Emma close as they watched the crew's frantic efforts to save what equipment and data they could. Brody was at the center of it all, shouting orders and securing hard drives filled with precious information. As they picked up speed, heading back towards the distant shore, Jake allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe they would make it out of this alive after all. But fate had other plans. A deafening crash echoed through the air as one of the largest sharks they'd seen yet launched itself clear out of the water, its enormous body slamming down onto the boat's stern. The impact shattered the railing and sent a spiderweb of cracks racing across the deck. "We're losing the back of the boat," someone screamed. Jake watched in horror as the stern began to sink, water rushing in at an alarming rate. Crew members scrambled to higher ground, abandoning equipment in their desperate bid for survival. "Emma!" Jake shouted, pulling his wife towards the bridge. "We need to get to the life rafts." But as they reached the storage area where the rafts were kept, they found Brody already there, his face a mask of despair. "They're gone," he said, his voice hollow. The impact? It must have knocked them loose. The reality of their situation hit Jake like a physical blow. They were sinking miles from shore, surrounded by monstrous predators unlike anything the world had ever seen. Emma's voice, steady despite the fear in her eyes, cut through Jake's rising panic. "The bridge. It's the highest point. If we can get there, maybe we can hold out until help arrives." Jake nodded, grateful for her clear thinking. "Dr. Brody, tell everyone to get to the bridge. It's our only chance." As they made their way up, helping crew members as they went, Jake couldn't help but marvel at the surreal horror of their situation. The once pristine research vessel was now a half-submerged wreck, its white hull stained with streaks of red where the sharks' attacks had drawn blood. From their elevated position on the bridge, they had a clear view of the chaos below. The mutant sharks continued their relentless assault, their massive bodies visible just beneath the surface as they circled what remained of the boat. Brody was on the radio, desperately calling for help. "Mayday, Mayday. This is the research vessel Nautilus. We are approximately 15 miles east of Chatham. We are under attack and sinking. I repeat, we are under attack and sinking." Jake held Emma close, his mind racing. They had survived their first encounter with these monsters on the beach, but this seemed hopeless. The water was steadily rising, and it was only a matter of time before the bridge itself was submerged. "Jake," Emma whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm scared." He tightened his arm around her. "I know. Me too. But we're going to get through this. We have to." as if in answer to their desperate prayers. The distant thrum of helicopter rotors cut through the air. A Coast Guard chopper appeared on the horizon, growing larger by the second as it raced towards them. A cheer went up from the survivors, but Jake's relief was short-lived. The sharks, agitated by the new noise, intensified their attack. The boat groaned and shifted ominously beneath their feet. "It's not going to make it in time," Brody said, his voice tight with fear. "We're sinking too fast." Jake looked around frantically, searching for anything that might buy them a few more precious minutes. His eyes landed on a flare gun in an emergency kit. Without hesitation, he grabbed it and moved to the edge of the bridge. "Jake, what are you doing?" Emma cried, reaching for him. He turned to her, his expression a mix of determination and fear. "Buying us some time." Before anyone could stop him, Jake fired the flare directly into the water where the sharks were most concentrated. The sea erupted in a blaze of red light and churning water as the creatures recoiled from the sudden intrusion. For a moment, the attack ceased. The helicopter was close now, its spotlight sweeping over the sinking vessel. "Everyone, get ready!" Jake shouted. "When that chopper gets here, we'll only have one shot at this." As the Coast Guard began their daring rescue, winching survivors up one by one, Jake kept his eyes on the water. The flare's effect wouldn't last long, and he knew the sharks would be back with a vengeance. Emma tugged at his arm as the winch came back down. "Jake, it's our turn. We have to go now." He nodded, helping her into the harness before securing himself beside her. As they were lifted into the air, Jake caught one last glimpse of the Nautilus. The mutant sharks had returned, their massive bodies slamming against what little remained of the boat. Just as they were pulled into the helicopter, the research vessel gave a final shuddering groan and slipped beneath the waves. Jake watched in horror as several of the monstrous creatures leapt from the water, their glowing eyes and nightmarish jaws snapping at the air where they had been moments before. As the helicopter banked and turned back toward shore, Jake held Emma close, both of them shaking with a mix of relief and lingering terror. They had survived, but at a terrible cost, and Jake knew with grim certainty that this was far from over. Dr. Brody, his face ashen but his eyes burning with determination, caught Jake's gaze. "We lost a lot down there," he said, having to shout over the roar of the rotors. "But we got enough. Enough to prove what's happening and maybe, just maybe, find a way to stop it." Jake nodded, his jaw set. They had entered this nightmare as honeymooners, but now found themselves on the front lines of a battle for survival. Whatever came next, Jake knew one thing for certain. He and Emma would face it together. As the lights of Chatham came into view, a new resolve settled over Jake. They had seen the face of a terror beyond imagination, and they had survived. Now, it was time to fight back. The Coast Guard helicopter touched down on a makeshift landing pad near Chatham Harbor, its rotors slowly winding down as medical personnel rushed forward to attend to the survivors. Jake helped Emma down from the aircraft, his legs shaky but his grip on her hand firm. The events of the past few hours felt surreal, like a nightmare they couldn't quite wake up from. Emergency vehicles surrounded the area, their flashing lights painting the pre-dawn sky in a kaleidoscope of red and blue. Jake could see news vans pulling up, reporters already jockeying for position behind the police barricades. Dr. Brody stumbled out of the helicopter behind them, his salt and pepper hair wild and his eyes wide with a mix of shock and determination. He clutched a waterproof case to his chest as if his life depended on it. "We need to secure this data immediately," Brody said, his voice hoarse. "If we lose this, we lose our only chance of understanding what we're up against." Before Jake could respond, they were swarmed by paramedics. Emma was gently but firmly guided towards an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over her shoulders. Jake tried to follow but was intercepted by Detective Larson. "Mr. Northwood," she said, her face grim. "I need you to come with me. We have to debrief you on what happened out there." Jake hesitated, looking back at Emma. She caught his eye and nodded, mouthing, "I'm okay," before allowing the paramedics to lead her away. "All right," Jake said, turning back to Larson. "But I'm not leaving without my wife. We do this together or not at all." Larson's expression softened slightly. "Of course. We'll conduct the debriefing at the hospital once the doctors have checked you both out." As they made their way through the chaos, Jake overheard snippets of conversation that made his blood run cold. 3 more attacks reported along the coast. Entire beach at Monomoy Island just gone. National Guard being mobilized. The gravity of the situation was sinking in. This wasn't just about their harrowing experience anymore. Something much bigger and more terrifying was unfolding. At the hospital, Jake was reunited with Emma in a private room. She looked pale but determined, her hair still damp from the sea spray. A doctor was just finishing up her examination when Detective Larson entered, followed by a man Jake didn't recognize. "Mr. and Mrs. Northwood," Larson began. "This is Agent Callahan from the Department of Homeland Security. He's here to assist with the investigation." Callahan, a tall man with a stern face and close-cropped hair, nodded curtly. "I understand you've been through quite an ordeal, but I need you to tell me everything you saw out there. Leave nothing out, no matter how strange it might seem." Jake and Emma exchanged glances before launching into their account. They described the massive mutated sharks, their unnatural behavior, the glowing eyes, and the relentless attack on the research vessel. As they spoke, Callahan's expression grew increasingly grave. When they finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. Callahan cleared his throat. "What you've described, it aligns with other reports we've been receiving up and down the coast. But the scale of what you encountered," he trailed off, shaking his head. "What aren't you telling us?" Emma asked. Emma, her voice steady despite her obvious exhaustion. Callahan hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "In the past 24 hours, we've had reports of similar attacks from Maine to Florida. Entire beaches have been evacuated. We've lost contact with several coastal communities." He paused, his next words clearly difficult to say. "We're facing a threat unlike anything we've ever seen before." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "So what happens now?" Before Callahan could answer, the door burst open. Dr. Brody rushed in, his eyes wild with excitement and fear. "You need to see this," he said, brandishing a tablet. "We've analyzed the data from the Nautilus. It's worse than we thought." He placed the tablet on a nearby table and everyone gathered around. On the screen was a complex genetic sequence, parts of it highlighted in angry red. "This is the DNA we collected from the shark samples," Brody explained. "See these sections here? They're not natural. They've been engineered, spliced in from other species. Whoever did this, they weren't just making bigger sharks. They were creating hybrids, mixing in genes from other marine predators, maybe even terrestrial ones." Emma gasped. "But why? Who would do something like this?" Brody's expression darkened. "That's not even the worst part. Look at this." He swiped to another screen showing a map of ocean currents. Red dots pulsed at various points along the east coast. These are the locations of reported attacks. But watch what happens when I overlay the projected spread based on the genetic markers we found. As they watched, the red dots began to multiply and spread, flowing with the currents. Within the simulation of a few weeks, the entire eastern seaboard was covered in an angry red swarm. "My God," Callahan breathed. "It's not just an attack. It's an invasion." Jake felt Emma's hand slip into his, squeezing tightly. He looked at her, saw the determination in her eyes that mirrored his own. They had started this journey as newlyweds on a simple honeymoon. Now, they found themselves at the center of what could be the greatest threat humanity had ever faced. "So what do we do?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. Callahan straightened, his jaw set. "We fight back. Dr. Brody, I need you and your team to work on finding a way to stop these creatures. Some kind of targeted virus, maybe, or a way to disrupt their genetic structure." Brody nodded eagerly. "I'll need a lab, equipment, and a team of the best geneticists we can find." "You'll have it," Callahan assured him. He turned to Jake and Emma. "As for you two, I know you've been through hell, but we need you. Your first-hand experience with these creatures is invaluable. Will you help us?" Jake and Emma exchanged a long look, an entire conversation passing between them without a word. Finally, Emma spoke. "We're in. Whatever it takes." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Jake and Emma were moved to a secure facility where they worked closely with Brody's team, providing detailed accounts of their encounters and helping to strategize potential countermeasures. The news from the outside world grew increasingly grim. Coastal cities were under siege, with reports of the mutant shark somehow managing to move short distances on land, attacking beachfront properties and dragging people into the water. The death toll was rising by the hour. One evening, about a week into their new reality, Jake found Emma standing alone in the facility's observation deck, staring out at the distant ocean. He approached quietly, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he murmured. Emma leaned back into him, sighing deeply. "I was just thinking about how different our lives were such a short time ago. We were supposed to be on our honeymoon. Jake, planning our future, talking about starting a family, and now—" Jake tightened his embrace. "I know. It's not fair. None of this is. But we're together, Em. Whatever happens, we face it as one." She turned in his arms, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Promise me something, Jake. Promise me that when this is all over, if we make it through, promise me we'll have that life we dreamed of. The house, the kids, the dog. All of it." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. "I promise," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll have all of that and more. This is just a detour, not the end of our story." Their moment was interrupted by the facility's alarm system blaring to life. Red lights flashed as a voice came over the intercom. "All personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Jake and Emma rushed to the command center, joining Brody, Callahan, and the rest of the team. The large screen at the front of the room showed a satellite view of the coastline, angry red blips moving inland at an alarming rate. "What's happening?" Jake demanded. Callahan's face was ashen. "They're evolving, adapting to land faster than we anticipated. We've got reports of hybrid creatures. Part shark, part who knows what, crawling out of the water and attacking coastal towns." Brody pushed his way to a computer terminal, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "I think I know why," he said, his voice tight with tension. "The genetic modifications we found, they're not stable. These creatures are mutating rapidly, incorporating DNA from everything they come into contact with." Emma gasped. "You mean—" Brody nodded grimly. "Every time they feed, they're potentially picking up new genetic material. They're not just hunting, they're evolving with every attack." The implications were staggering. Jake felt a wave of despair threatening to overwhelm him, but he pushed it down. They couldn't afford to give up now. "What's our next move?" he asked, looking to Callahan. The agent was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the screen showing the unfolding chaos. Finally, he spoke. "We need to buy Brody and his team more time. If they can develop a way to destabilize these creatures' genetic structure, we might have a chance. But until then," he paused, his expression hardening, "we fight." Over the next few hours, plans were made and orders given. The National Guard was fully mobilized, with additional military support being called in from across the country. Coastal evacuation orders were expanded, pushing civilians further inland. Jake and Emma found themselves being prepped for a dangerous mission. They would be joining a special ops team, heading to one of the hardest hit areas to gather more data and, if possible, capture a live specimen for Brody to study. As they geared up, Jake couldn't help but marvel at the surreal turn their lives had taken. 2 weeks ago, the most dangerous thing they'd planned was a sunset snorkeling trip. Now, they were suiting up in tactical gear, preparing to face nightmarish creatures straight out of a horror movie. "You okay?" Emma asked, checking the straps on Jake's bulletproof vest. He managed a wry smile. "Just thinking this isn't exactly the honeymoon activities we had in mind." Emma's answering laugh was tinged with nervousness, but her eyes were steady. "Well, for better or for worse, right? I'd say this definitely falls under the worse category." Jake leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. "As long as we're together, we can face anything. I love you, Em." "I love you too," she whispered back. Their moment was interrupted by the team leader, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Martinez. "All right, lovebirds, time to move out. Birds are waiting on the roof." As they made their way to the helipad, Jake's mind raced with everything they'd learned and experienced. The mutant sharks, the rapid evolution, the global threat. It all seemed too big, too overwhelming. But as he felt Emma's hand slip into his, he found his resolve strengthening. They had started this journey as newlyweds, excited for a peaceful beach honeymoon. Now they found themselves on the front lines of a war for humanity's survival. It wasn't the life they had planned, but they were in it together. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying them towards an uncertain and dangerous future, Jake squeezed Emma's hand. Whatever horrors awaited them, whatever nightmarish creatures they would face, they would confront it as one. Their love, tested by unimaginable circumstances, had only grown stronger. The coast grew closer, the signs of destruction already visible from the air. Beaches lay empty, boardwalks destroyed, and in the water, dark shapes moved with unnatural speed and purpose. Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. This was far from the end of their story. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. A baptism by fire for their new life together, forging their bond in the crucible of an unprecedented threat. As the helicopter descended towards their landing zone, Jake and Emma exchanged one last look, a silent promise passing between them. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, for better or for worse. In this strange new world of monster sharks and mutant horrors, their love would be their strength and their guiding light. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment filled the sterile hospital room as Jake slowly regained consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus in the harsh fluorescent light. As awareness returned, so did the pain, a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to encompass his entire body. Jake, can you hear me?" Emma's voice, tinged with worry and exhaustion, cut through the fog in his mind. He turned his head slightly, wincing at the movement to see his wife sitting beside the bed. Her face was pale, dark circles under her eyes speaking to sleepless nights, but her gaze was filled with relief as she met his. "Em," he croaked, his throat dry and raw. What happened?" Emma's hand found his, squeezing gently. "You've been out for 3 days. The mission—" "Things went wrong, Jake. Do you remember?" As she spoke, fragments of memory began to surface. The helicopter ride to the coast, the eerie silence of the abandoned beach town, and then Jake's eyes widened as the full horror of what had happened came rushing back. "The ambush," he whispered. "Those things, they came out of nowhere." Emma nodded grimly. "They've evolved again. They can move on land now, at least for short periods. We were unprepared." Jake struggled to sit up, ignoring the protest of his battered body. "The team? Did everyone make it out?" Emma's face fell, and Jake felt his heart sink. "We lost Martinez and Reyes," she said softly. "Johnson's in critical condition. The rest of us made it, but—" She trailed off, her eyes filled with unshed tears. Jake pulled her close, ignoring the pain that flared at the movement. They held each other in silence for a long moment, both processing the weight of what they'd been through. A knock at the door interrupted their embrace. Dr. Brody entered, looking even more disheveled than usual. His eyes lit up when he saw Jake awake. "Mr. Northwood, thank goodness you're back with us," he said, approaching the bed. "How are you feeling?" Jake managed a wry smile. "Like I went 10 rounds with a shark on steroids, which I guess isn't far from the truth." Brody's expression turned serious. "What you encountered out there, it's accelerating faster than we anticipated. The genetic instability is leading to rapid mutations. We're seeing new hybrid forms emerging almost daily." Emma leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "But you've made progress, right? Tell me this hasn't all been for nothing." Brody hesitated, then nodded. "We have made some breakthroughs. The samples you managed to collect before things went south, they've given us invaluable data." He moved to the small table near the bed, opening a laptop to show them a complex series of genetic models. "We've identified the key sequences responsible for the rapid mutations. If we can develop a targeted virus to disrupt these sequences, we might be able to destabilize the entire population." Jake felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. "So we have a chance?" "A chance, yes," Brody confirmed. "But we're in a race against time. Every day these creatures are spreading further, evolving into forms more suited for land and air. If we don't act soon—" He didn't need to finish the thought. They all knew the stakes. Another knock at the door preceded the entry of Agent Callahan. The normally unflappable agent looked haggard, his suit rumpled and his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "Glad to see you're awake, Northwood," he said gruffly. "We need all hands on deck for what's coming." Jake straightened, ignoring the pain that shot through his body. "What's the situation?" Callahan's face was grim as he pulled up a chair. "It's bad. We've lost contact with most of the eastern seaboard. The creatures have overrun coastal defenses in multiple states. We're looking at a full-scale invasion." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Emma's hand found Jake's again, squeezing tightly. "So what's our next move?" Jake asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Callahan leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We're initiating Operation Firewall. A last-ditch effort to contain the spread and buy Dr. Brody the time he needs to develop a countermeasure." He unfolded a map on the bed, pointing to various locations along the coast. "We're setting up a series of fortified zones using natural barriers and military might to create a defensive line. But we need people who understand these creatures, who've faced them and survived." Jake met Emma's gaze, seeing the same mix of fear and determination. He felt reflected in her eyes. They both knew what Callahan was asking without him having to say it. "When do we leave?" Emma asked, her voice quiet but resolute. Callahan's expression softened slightly. "As soon as Jake is cleared by medical. I know you've both been through hell, but we need you. Your experience could make the difference between success and, well, extinction." The gravity of the situation hung heavy in the air. Jake took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain in his ribs. "We're in," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Brody cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "There's something else you should know," he said hesitantly. "The latest data suggests, well, it suggests that these creatures might be developing some form of collective intelligence." Emma's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "Their attacks are becoming more coordinated," Brody explained. "We're seeing evidence of complex strategies, of the kind that shouldn't be possible for individual predators, no matter how evolved." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying they're working together? Like a hive mind?" Brody nodded grimly. "It's a working theory, but one that fits the observed behavior. If true, it means we're up against something far more dangerous than we initially thought." Callahan stood abruptly, his face set in determined lines. "All the more reason to move quickly. I'll have the medical team expedite your clearance, Northwood. We move out in 24 hours. As Callahan and Brody left to make preparations, Jake and Emma found themselves alone once more. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on them, the enormity of the task they faced almost overwhelming. Emma moved to sit on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle Jake's injuries. "Are we crazy for doing this?" she asked softly. "We're not soldiers or scientists. We're just us." Jake reached out, cupping her face gently. "We're survivors," he said firmly. "We've faced these things and lived to tell about it. That counts for something." He paused, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "Besides, remember what we promised each other? Whatever happens, we face it together." Emma leaned into his touch, a small smile breaking through her worry. "For better or for worse," she murmured. "Exactly," Jake said, pulling her close for a gentle kiss. "And when this is all over, we'll have that life we dreamed of. The house, the kids, the dog, all of it." As they held each other, the beeping of the medical equipment a steady rhythm in the background, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had started this journey as newlyweds on a simple beach vacation. Now they found themselves on the front lines of humanity's fight for survival. It wasn't the honeymoon they had planned, but in a strange way it had brought them closer than ever before. Their love, tested by unimaginable circumstances, had only grown stronger. The next 24 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Jake underwent a battery of tests and physical therapy sessions, pushing his body to its limits in preparation for what lay ahead. Emma worked closely with Brody's team, absorbing as much information as she could about the mutant creatures and their evolving capabilities. As they prepared to board the helicopter that would take them to the front lines, Jake and Emma stood hand in hand, looking out over the facility that had been their home for the past weeks. "Ready for this?" Jake asked, giving Emma's hand a squeeze. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. As ready as I'll ever be. You? Jake nodded, his jaw set. Let's go save the world. As they climbed aboard the chopper, joining Callahan, Brody, and a team of specially trained operatives, Jake couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn their lives had taken. They had entered this nightmare as honeymooners, wide-eyed and unprepared. Now they were heading into the heart of the storm, armed with knowledge, experience, and an unshakable bond. The helicopter lifted off, carrying them towards an uncertain future. But as Jake felt Emma's hand in his, he knew that whatever horrors awaited them, whatever nightmarish creatures they would face, they would confront it as one. Their honeymoon had become a baptism by fire, forging their relationship in the crucible of an unprecedented threat. As the coastline came into view, the signs of destruction already visible from the air, Jake and Emma exchanged one last look, a silent promise passing between them. This was far from the end of their story. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. A new chapter in a life together that neither of them could have imagined, but one they would face with courage, determination, and above all love. The battle for humanity's survival lay ahead, but Jake and Emma Northwood were ready. Together they would stand against the tide of mutant horrors, their bond serving as a beacon of hope in the darkest of times. For better or for worse, indeed. Chapter 10. The New Normal. The sun was setting over what remained of Chatham's coastline, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink that seemed almost obscene given the devastation below. Jake stood at the edge of the hastily constructed military base, his eyes scanning the horizon where the churning waters met the scarred shoreline. 6 months had passed since that fateful day when he and Emma had first encountered the mutant sharks. 6 months of battles, close calls, and heart-wrenching losses. The world they had known was gone, replaced by a constant struggle for survival against an ever-evolving threat. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Emma's voice came from behind him, a welcome respite from the dark turn his mind had taken. Jake turned, managing a small smile as his wife approached. Emma looked different now. Her once soft features had hardened, her eyes carrying a vigilant gleam that never quite faded. Like him, she bore the scars of their ongoing war, both physical and emotional. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Jake replied, wrapping an arm around her as she joined him at the lookout. "Remember when our biggest worry was whether we'd get a good spot on the beach?" Emma let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "Seems like a lifetime ago." Their moment of reflection was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Dr. Brody, looking even more disheveled than usual, hurried towards them with a tablet clutched in his hands. "Jake, Emma, thank goodness I found you," he panted, his eyes wild with a mix of excitement and fear. "We've made a breakthrough, but, well, you need to see this for yourselves." They followed Brody to the command center, a reinforced bunker that had become the nerve center of their operations. Inside, screens lined the walls, displaying real-time data from sensors along the coast and live feeds from underwater drones. Agent Callahan was already there, his face grim as he studied one of the larger displays. He nodded curtly as they entered. "Glad you're here. Brody, show them what you found." The scientist tapped at his tablet, and the main screen came to life with a complex genetic model. "We've been analyzing the latest samples, trying to understand the accelerated evolution we've been seeing," Brody began, his voice tight with tension. "What we've discovered is, well, it's unprecedented." Jake leaned in, studying the swirling patterns of DNA. "What exactly are we looking at, Doc?" Brody took a deep breath. "This is the genetic structure of one of the more recently evolved creatures. See these sequences here?" He pointed to a series of highlighted sections. "They're not just shark DNA or even a mix of marine predators. We're seeing mammalian genes, avian genes, even human genes." Emma gasped, her hand finding Jake's and squeezing tightly. "Human? How is that possible?" "We think it's happening through consumption," Callahan interjected, his voice grim. "Every time these things feed, they're not just gaining sustenance. They're absorbing genetic material and incorporating it into their own DNA." The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. "So every person they've killed has potentially contributed to their evolution, yes," Brody finished, his face pale. But that's not even the most alarming part. Look at this. He swiped to a new screen, showing a series of brain scans. These are from specimens we've managed to capture over the past few months. The neural complexity is increasing at an exponential rate. They're not just getting physically stronger or more adaptable. They're getting smarter. A heavy silence fell over the room as the weight of this revelation sank in. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he remembered the coordinated attacks they'd faced, the seemingly impossible strategies the creatures had employed. "How smart are we talking?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brody's response was cut off by a sudden blaring of alarms. Red lights flashed as one of the technicians called out, "Multiple contacts approaching from the east. They've breached the outer perimeter." Callahan sprang into action, barking orders into his comm unit. "All units to battle stations, this is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." Jake and Emma exchanged a quick glance. Years of fighting side by side allowing them to communicate volumes without a word. They moved as one, grabbing their gear from a nearby locker and checking their weapons with practiced efficiency. As they rushed out of the command center, following Callahan and a team of soldiers, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this attack was different. There was a palpable sense of dread in the air, a foreboding that went beyond their usual pre-battle tension. They emerged onto the base's eastern defensive line just as the first wave of creatures became visible. Jake's breath caught in his throat at the sight. These weren't the mutant sharks they'd grown accustomed to fighting. These were something new, something terrifyingly advanced. The beings that charged towards them moved with an unsettling blend of animal and human-like gaits. Their bodies were a nightmarish fusion of shark, mammal, and something altogether alien, but it was their eyes that chilled Jake to his core. Intelligent, calculating, and filled with a cold, alien hunger. "Open fire!" Callahan's voice rang out, and the night erupted in a cacophony of gunshots and inhuman shrieks. Jake and Emma fought back to back, their movements synchronized from months of combat together. But for every creature they brought down, two more seemed to take its place. The defensive line began to buckle under the relentless assault. "Fall back to secondary positions," Callahan ordered, his voice barely audible over the chaos of battle. As they retreated, Jake caught glimpses of the creatures working together with chilling efficiency. They used complex flanking maneuvers, created diversions, and even appeared to be using rudimentary tools fashioned from debris. "Jake!" Emma's shout snapped his attention back to their immediate surroundings. One of the larger creatures had broken through, its massive jaws snapping inches from Emma's face as she struggled to hold it at bay with her rifle. Without hesitation, Jake emptied his clip into the beast's side. It let out an ear-splitting shriek before collapsing, dark ichor oozing from its wounds. "Thanks," Emma panted, her eyes wide with residual fear and adrenaline. Jake nodded grimly, reloading his weapon. Always. They had no time to catch their breath as the battle raged on. Hours seemed to blur together in a nightmarish haze of gunfire, explosions, and the constant, terrifying presence of their evolving enemy. As dawn broke, painting the blood-soaked battlefield in a sickly light, Jake found himself back-to-back with Emma once more. They were surrounded, cut off from the main force, with dwindling ammunition and exhaustion setting in. "Well," Jake said, managing a wry smile despite their dire situation, "this isn't quite how I pictured spending our first year of marriage." Emma let out a short, breathless laugh. "You mean you didn't envision fighting mutant shark monsters when you said, 'for better or for worse'?" Their moment of gallows humor was interrupted by a bone-chilling roar. The creatures surrounding them parted, making way for something massive. Jake felt his heart sink as he saw what approached. It was unlike anything they'd encountered before. Easily 20 feet tall, its body a terrifying blend of shark, ape, and something utterly alien. But it was the eyes that truly horrified Jake. They were unmistakably intelligent, filled with a cold, calculating hatred. As the monstrosity loomed over them, Jake met Emma's gaze one last time. In that moment, a lifetime of love, shared experiences, and unspoken promises passed between them. "Together," Emma whispered, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. Jake nodded, tightening his grip on his weapon. Always, they turned as one to face the approaching horror, prepared to make their final stand. But just as the creature reared back to strike, the air was split by the deafening roar of jet engines. A squadron of fighter jets screamed overhead, unleashing a barrage of missiles that lit up the morning sky. The giant creature let out an ear-splitting shriek as it was engulfed in explosions, its massive body crumpling to the ground. In the chaos that followed, Jake and Emma found themselves being pulled to safety by a rescue team. As they were rushed to a waiting helicopter, Jake caught one last glimpse of the battlefield. The tide had turned, with reinforcements pushing back the invading horde. As the chopper lifted off, Jake pulled Emma close, both of them trembling with exhaustion and residual adrenaline. They had survived yet another brush with death. But the war was far from over. "What now?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible over the thrum of the rotors. Jake looked out at the scarred landscape below, his mind racing with the implications of what they'd learned and what they'd just faced. "Now," he said slowly, "we adapt. We evolve. Just like they have." He turned back to Emma, seeing the same determination in her eyes that he felt. "We've faced the impossible before, and we're still here. Whatever comes next, we face it together." As the helicopter carried them back to base, Jake knew that their lives would never be the same. The world had changed irrevocably, and they had changed with it. But through it all, their love had remained constant, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges they could scarcely imagine. But as long as they had each other, Jake knew they could face anything. This new normal, as terrifying as it was theirs to shape. And shape it they would, together.